All right, everybody. So we're back with another presentation here. Today we're going to talk about the principles of breath control, which would be the third discussion of markers of control within the movement continuum. The first being pain, the second being postural control. This will be the third, breath control, and the fourth will be impact control, which we'll do in the next presentation. So this is, I think, a pretty important presentation because the breath really links so many things within the body for our movement and also just human health in general. So why does breath matter? Well, one, it links respiration, postural control, and performance. It also has a direct influence on nervous system regulation. So it allows us to create force. It also allows us to deeply relax. So it ties through so many things from both ends of the spectrum within the human body and human health. It can be, if we choose to train it and train it well, the key to mobility, stability, force production, as well as energy efficiency. So let's start with the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory diaphragm, because I think the respiratory diaphragm is like an origin story for breath control. So if we understand a little bit about the anatomy and physiology, it helps us understand, everything else about this conversation. So the respiratory diaphragm is a dome-shaped musculotendinous sheet, and it separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It's composed of the central tendon, which is the insertion of the muscle, and then the muscular attachments go to the sternum, the back of the xiphoid process, the ribs 7 through 12, and its costal cartilages, and then the lumbar spine, it goes through L1 through L3. So it's got several vast attachments that really affect a lot of things within the trunk. So, oftentimes because it's deep, it's hard to see and hard to comprehend the attachments and actions of the diaphragm. It also has a intertwining with the psoas major muscle. So there's a lot of connections, especially to lower back pain or any type of spinal pain. And what's the function of the diaphragm, which then just means how is our breath being controlled. So some important openings and hiatuses that you see within the diaphragm are the caval opening, which is at T8 for the inferior vena cava. And then there's also the aortic hiatus around T12 for the aorta. So that's just two heart vessels basically that run right through the diaphragm. So you can see how there's very close connections anatomically to how the breath can control things like heart rate and even our heart health. And then at T10, there's the esophageal hiatus, which the esophagus and the vagus nerves run through. So you can also see the esophagus being part of the digestive system, how we breathe can affect our digestion. And then the vagus nerve is the cranial nerve that affects the autonomic nervous system. So how we breathe can stimulate the vagus nerve or kind of keep some of the pressure built up around that area and have it function better or worse, which can then affect our autonomic nervous system. The primary function of the respiratory diaphragm is inspiration. So we use the diaphragm to breathe in, and it does this by having the dome descend or drop down, which creates a negative pressure environment for the chest or the thoracic wall where the lungs are. So it allows the lungs to fill. The lungs are usually passive in the process of breathing, where the diaphragm is more of the active muscle, and it drops down, but that dropping down then puts pressure downward on the abdominal organs, distends the abdominal wall, can actually move down into the pelvic floor and create a distension or an eccentric orientation down there, expands the rib cage, and it coordinates all of this to help with breathing, postural stability, and also the expansion and compression of the breath helps to create a pumping effect for which helps venous return as well as lymphatic return. So two words that will come into play here when we think about breathing, and we've talked about them with other movements, and I got the terminology from Bill Hartman, so I highly recommend looking at his work. And I think he will be the first to admit that he got the terminology from the world of physics and just looking at the universe. It expands and it compresses. So we can easily make sense of this within the breath, where the inhalation is expansion, the exhalation is compression. And when we're looking at what we're trying to move towards or a standard of more ideal breath control, we're oftentimes looking to get as much of an expansive breath throughout the body from the center out during the inhalation, and then be able to compress more towards midline during the exhalation, especially if we're trying to go through a full excursion of breath. And a full excursion of breath can be more tied into if we're trying to promote joint mobility or relative motion between the joints. And then there's going to be times, which we'll talk about, where we want to limit some of that full excursion of the breath purposely to pressurize it and create force and create strength. But when we inhale, we'll start with the idea of a full excursion of the breath. We're going to look at the respiratory diaphragm widening and again dropping down, as mentioned before, which will then move the central tendon down. The wings of the diaphragm will move laterally. And then this downward pressure puts pressure on the internal organs and the abdominal fluids around that area. And then that moves pressure from in to out. So we get a little bit wider down into the abdomen and the lower rib cage. This downward cascade then also has the potential to move the pelvic floor downward. And you can think of it as it's like loading a trampoline. So it can hopefully create a elastic recoil to help the diaphragm move upward during the exhalation phase. The lungs will then expand, as mentioned, through the negative pressure environment. And then motions such as external rotation, flexion, abduction, supination can be promoted through this expansive inhalation. With exhalation, it's just really the opposite. The diaphragm will compress or recoil. So through a full excursion of breath, there's really not a lot of active motion that's going to happen within the musculature. It would be more of a recoil of the diaphragm, recoil of some of the tissues, the connective tissues around the thoracic cage. There can be and will likely be some abdominal activity, but the intention isn't to create muscle contraction because it'll just increase the internal pressure. We want to keep the internal pressure a little bit lower when we're trying to really deflate or go through a full excursion of breath. So the pressure release on the internal organs and the abdominal fluids will move pressure from out to in. And then the pressure reversal, it can recoil the pelvic floor as if you had just stepped on a trampoline and the elastic recoil of the trampoline moves things back upward. So this promotes motions such as internal rotation, extension, adduction, and pronation. So again, if we're thinking about the full excursion of a breath, we have the ability to ideally expand from the center out and really move that breath and that expansion through the body with a cascade of pressure. And then as we're exhaling, we can think of it as we're fully deflating. We're trying to get all the air out. Well, that will move us back towards midline. 4 phases of the breath that we could look at and try to train would be the inhale and the exhale, as mentioned, which is the expansion and compression. But then we can also look at the transitions between the inhale and exhale, as well as between the exhale and back towards the inhale again. Sometimes these are referred to as the apex hold between the inhale and the exhale, and then between the exhale and the subsequent inhale would be more of the base hold. So we're filled up after the inhale, we're expanded, and we just hang out there. We take a slight pause there. Think of that as an isometric contraction of the diaphragm. And then the base hold would be more when we're emptied. We've gotten as much of the air or the pressure out of the body as we can. We hang out there for a little bit and see how the body feels before then expanding again during the inhale. So, all know I like a good continuum. So we're going to look at 3 different breath continua as we talk about breath control. There's the where, the how long, and how much pressure or how intense. So at the where, we can think of that as the direction. At one end of the spectrum, we're looking at this expansive center out breath that we're talking about, and what we're looking for is more ideal. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be more paradoxical accessory, where the abdomen actually will pull in on the inhale because we're getting the expansion up higher in the upper part of the thoracic cage. And this happens usually due to accessory muscle activities such as the sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, upper traps, pec minor, things that attach to the collarbones in the upper rib cage that creates a little bit more expansion up higher, but then makes us skinnier down lower. So that's why it's usually referred to as paradoxical breathing, because instead of having this expansive motion, which would be typical of a nice full range of motion action of the respiratory diaphragm, we instead get a very small amount of movement from the respiratory diaphragm, and we get more of the movement up higher. So it actually looks like we're getting skinnier, and that the pressure is more compressed down where the respiratory diaphragm is. We're generally going to be, as movement professionals, seeing people with a paradoxical or accessory type of breathing pattern, or they're moving more towards that. And if we do have to make change to breath control, we're going to generally want to be moving them towards the expansive center out type of breath on the continuum. And then from a how long perspective, we can look at on one side of the spectrum would be slow or smooth cycles of breath and full breath holds even, and how well we can control a breath hold at different parts of or different phases of the breath. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be a rapid, shallow, hyperventilatory style breath. So when we're more on that rapid side of things, we're getting more of a sympathetic drive. Usually there's reduced stability because the pressures that we would create with the breath that would promote stability tend to be reduced because they don't have enough time to actually take hold and create that pressure. So the slower, smoother cycles will look at building efficiency, maybe mobility, because again, we can go through a full excursion of breath, so we can guide our mobility where we want to guide it and decrease the pressure that might be getting in the way of our joints moving. It can also help promote endurance and more of a parasympathetic tone. And then full breath holds oftentimes fit within trying to train a slower breath. And sometimes when we spend some time in a breath hold, it can actually be very peaceful because there's really not expansion or compression at that time. So it feels very much like if we're in control of that, that sort of time stands still in different ways. But we have to be able to train that in a way that doesn't feel like we're suffocating and that we're building some tolerance to that. And a lot of times that includes the idea of getting more tolerant to carbon dioxide buildup within the system. All right, but just from a time perspective, on one end of the spectrum, we're not breathing at all, we're just holding the breath, and on the other end of the spectrum, we're breathing too rapidly and we're closer to hyperventilation. And then pressurization, or how intense we want to be with the breath, is really dependent on the intention of the activity. So we may be on one side of the spectrum in a Valsalva maneuver or very high pressure situation where we're bracing, and this is going to be during heavy lifts. We're trying to maximize stability, especially in the lumbar region. And then on the other side, we're more relaxed, we're conversational with our breath, where the pressure is lower internally. We have minimal effort, or we might even get to something that's more of a barely discernible breath. And then here's just the depiction of that in a chart here. So the where from expansive on one side to more paradoxical on the other side. Then there's the how long, full breath holds, slow deep cycles, and then rapid shallow cycles. So we can see we're somewhere on that spectrum. And anytime we are on a continuum, again, we appreciate that things aren't good or bad. They're just, everything has its own purpose, but it's more what is the intent that we're going for. Now, say typically, like we're rarely going to train people towards a paradoxical or accessory breath or towards rapid or shallow cycles, but there are purposes for doing that. We just tend to do this more instinctually. The one time I can think of is where we might actually cue someone to be a little bit more rapid and shallow with their breath is if we wanted to really stimulate. And this is done frequently before heavy lifts or before short duration, high intensity work. So in powerlifting, you'll see people do this, but then they'll also take a hit of smelling salts, which will naturally increase their paradoxical accessory activity in their rapid shallow cycles because it creates a sympathetic drive, and you want that during high intensity, short duration endeavors. But for the most part, what we're dealing with is people who have some type of chronic condition or they have some type of pain condition that we want to be able to turn the volume down and desensitize oftentimes. So we're going to, for the most part, be working people back to more of an expansive center out style of breath and have them manipulating maybe some breath holds while they increase the duration of each phase of the breath. And then again, with Valsalva, high pressure versus conversational relaxed, it's really a similar conversation. We want to teach people actually how to pressurize well to be strong. Like that's one of the more important parts of strength training, I think, is to have them start with this center out idea. And everybody's heard of core training, but to actually show them what that means, it really has to start with the breath from my perspective. And if you don't understand how to create pressure centrally, then you probably don't understand anything about core work. So that becomes like an important part of that side. But on the other side, obviously, it's really important to be able to relax And when the time comes to not overbreathe, that you know how to do that and you have the potential to do that. So that will bring us into some different things that we may use breath control for in the clinic and in our own practice. So for mobility, we can look at a full excursion of breath in multiple positions as what we're trying to attain when we're looking at, optimal joint mobility. So I think yoga is a really good practice for understanding this. If you have a yoga practice, usually there are different asanas and vinyasas that you will flow through. So you can feel where when you hit closer to what would feel like a joint restriction or a soft tissue restriction, is that there is a tendency to also restrict your breathing. And as you do that, you will feel like you have less endurance in the position and then everything gets harder. But over time, just spending time in that position and getting more control of the breath and being able to really take the breath through a fuller excursion, not only will the position feel easier, but you'll actually be able to get deeper into it and ride the breath to get deeper into the position. So making the breath really the intent allows the position itself to change, right? Which gives us some type of connection between our joint mobility, our soft tissue mobility, whatever it is, our positional mobility, and the breath, and that they are really inextricably linked. So I think that's one of the best ways to try to explain this to patients is whenever they are getting into a place where they have to hold their breath, and it's not going to necessarily be harmful, but it is certainly getting in the way of joint motion if that is the goal. And then the other way to look at this is if we want to be promoting joint mobility, oftentimes we have to make positions easier for people so that they have an easier time to breathe, at least initially. And then we can put them in positions that are a little bit more challenging, slow things down, but then cue them to think about a full excursion of breath. So if there's no training for what a full excursion of breath means, then let's not put them in a hard position and then try to have them do that training, but maybe have them do that training in a more favorable environment where things don't feel as challenging to the musculoskeletal system or the endurance or the conditioning of the individual. So ultimately, we can look at like the more concentric muscle contraction too that is being promoted, the less possible it is to take a full excursion of breath. So if we have to really, really be contracting our muscles at a high level, we're really not going to be able to have the body go through a full excursion of breath. So that those movements and those positions aren't the best for promoting relative motion between the joints. So making things a bit easier, you could still make the position that you're trying to train look like the one that you want to eventually add resistance to and build strength with. But just by adding some assistance, now you can make it a mobility exercise where you could focus on breath control. And then we can look at breath is it can enhance or restrict the direction of movement, as we just talked about, but it's helpful to look at directing the breath towards the movements that we're trying to train, where inhalation, as we mentioned before, is more expansive. So maybe we direct that to when we're trying to promote external rotation, abduction, flexion, supination, anywhere through the body. And then vice versa, when exhalation would be more compressive. So for motions like we're trying to go internal rotation, adduction, extension, pronation, then we can kind of look at how we're exhaling and are we able to get a full excursion of compression or kind of release of pressure as we do that. And then usually most positions that we go through will have an interplay between the expansion and the compression. So I think a good example would be just shoulder, hand behind back, which that promotes these compressive movements of internal rotation, adduction, and extension. But as we go behind back, we're going to have to take an inhale at some point. So it might be useful to think about that inhale maybe more at the chest wall and trying to really see if we can get expansion in the front of the chest wall, because oftentimes the compensations we'll see when we go behind the back will be a caving of the chest wall, or it'll be the humerus kicks forward a little bit, which then caves in the chest a little bit. So just by being able to expand the chest wall during the inhale, it can help to keep us in the position we're looking for as we're compressing behind the back without compensating, without cheating, And then on the exhale, we can then promote the deflation or the recoil of the respiratory diaphragm while we're also guiding further into the direction that we're looking for of internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So we can actually use the muscles of internal rotation, adduction, and extension to move farther in the direction that we're trying to work on the exhale. Where on the inhale, we don't necessarily try to need to go farther into the position, but we might have an expansive cue to go against different compensations that might come into play. Having this idea of when do we use the inhale, when do we use the exhale, or using the inhale and the exhale strategically can really help us guide mobility limitations. And then pressurization is another thing that we can look at depending on the intent. So you can use higher pressure sometimes to contract a muscle concentrically to move the joint in the position that we want to go to. So with the same example of hands behind back, if we use the exhale to really try to create maybe a little bit more muscle force in the internal rotators, such as the lats, even getting into something like the subscat, and just thinking in that direction that we're trying to move and that we're restricted. If it is restricted, we might have to use some higher pressure and higher concentric orientation to really help us direct because we're really at our end of motion. So that's a possibility too. But sometimes it can be useful, especially if we're trying to mobilize for a longer period of time to keep the pressure lower in the body, and that allows us to go through a fuller excursion of breath. And if we're too high with our pressure, then we're not really going to be able to maintain the exercise or the position that we're looking for as long of a period of time. And it kind of fits with the idea of when we train for strength, we're usually not going to be able to do that for as long of a period of time as if we train for endurance. So there's sort of endurance and strength possibilities within joint mobility. I think in the long run that we'll get the most out of doing things with a little less pressure in the body. And then we could be strategic with when we use the higher pressure situation to really direct our muscles. So on the other end of the spectrum, we could look at using the breath to promote intra-abdominal pressure, which then promotes more lumbar spine stability. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows that intra-abdominal pressure acts as an internal weight belt to increase lumbar spine stability and increase spinal stiffness and protection under load. This tends to be optimized during the mid to full inhalation, and then we will, as we start to try to compress, we control the hold of that breath and create an abdominal brace on top of it. So this is where during an exhale, if we pressurize, we will actually promote more abdominal activity. The abdominals are one of the primary accessory muscles for exhalation. Accessory meaning that, this is outside of just the natural resting recoil of the diaphragm, but there'll be some muscles that also help to pull the ribs down, and the abdominals become a big part of that. So really pressurizing the onset of the exhale is where we're going to get the most of this intra-abdominal pressure. And then there's a synergy here between the diaphragm. The diaphragm contracts to take that mid to full inhalation. And then we're also going to be thinking about if we did create a good diaphragmatic inhale, then we'll probably create a little bit of a eccentric orientation of the pelvic floor initially. But then this is where the pressurization and the controlled hold, that's going to now create a action of the pelvic floor that might be a little bit more protective so things don't move downward too much, right? We want to really optimize the ceiling and the floor of the abdominal area so that diaphragm, you can think of it as the ceiling, the pelvic floor would be more of the floor, and the abdominals would be like the front wall, and then you have the spinal stabilizers on the back that would be more of the posterior wall. So all of those are synergizing together to really trap this pressure at the time that it's needed most. And that's usually during the heaviest or the hardest part of a high intensity effort. And then we can manipulate breath even more depending on the intensity or the speed of movement. So for strength, I mean, that's basically what we just talked about with intra-abdominal pressure. We're trying to expand and pressurize. Pressurize, the pressurization will be then extended out through the duration of the lift. So if it's a deadlift and it takes us 5 seconds to go from the ground to standing, then we're probably creating that pressurization through that whole part, or at least through the hardest part of the lift, depending on what that is. Usually it's the kind of sticking point or getting it off the ground. But everybody's a little bit different where they feel like they have the hardest time. So you're using pressurization to give you more concentric strength to lift the weight, but also to not lose your shape, right? So one of the ways to think about intra-abdominal pressure would be like the soda can analogy, where when a soda can is well pressurized and the top of it hasn't been popped yet, it's really hard to break the soda can or dent the soda can. But as soon as you pop the top and you release some of that pressure, well, now it's really easy to dent the soda can. Stuff's coming out, liquid's coming out, and if there's no liquid in there anymore, it's really easy to dent that can. So the intra-abdominal pressure is really trying to keep your soda can as firm as possible while stuff is hard. And then you can release the pressure later so you can breathe again. And this is where this should be short-lived, because high pressures for long periods of time certainly not great, but if you do it in the right moment, it's actually very good to be able to resist load, and to protect yourself from heavy loads. So the idea there is really to resist motion during these low velocity efforts. But then if we add power into the mix, we're just adding a higher velocity. Now we're expanding in a similar way to prepare, but the pressurization during the exhale will be more quick. And you can think of exercise or like the kettlebell swing, where you're timing like a hiss breath during the hip pop of the movement. Or, if you ever watch tennis, you hear a grunt during the forehand. Well, the grunt is a version of a a powerful exhale in the moment of contact. So power movements, they are throughout sports, and you don't always hear a sound, but usually if we're getting the power right, it's at impact where we'll hear the pressurization of the exhale. But the inhale could be really important there to expand, to prepare. So in the deadlift example, we can think about going up quite a bit lighter with the weight. You still expand at the bottom to prepare. So if you're wearing a weight belt, you breathe into the weight belt. But now it's, instead of it being a high Valsalva like pressure during a slower lift, it's going to be a quick hiss or a quick pop to stand, or even like a jumping version of the deadlift. And the breath is going to be quicker because it's got to match the speed of the movement. With endurance, we're really trying to conserve energy. And when we're talking about endurance here, just the pure definition of endurance would be to be able to go longer, more than to try to be as fast as you can for a long duration. So we're not trying to get your best marathon time, but just be able to do a marathon would be the idea. So how do we want to breathe for that? Well, we have to try to find a way to conserve energy. So more rhythmic, efficient cycles, can be nasal, conversational with the breath. So that's going to be on one end of the spectrum when we talk about endurance, that we're trying not to overpressurize so we can do basically the bare minimum with our breath, but still do the task that we want to do. And then with speed, the pressurization is going to be dependent on the duration. So again, if it's a very short duration, the pressurization might be pretty high, similar to a power strength type of breath. And some sprinters will be able to do 100 meters maybe on one breath, and because they're able to hold the pressurization for a long period of time, because they're doing so much work with the acceleration and deceleration of their limbs, that they don't want to lose any pressure in that process. But you're not going to be able to do that for very long. So the longer the duration of the task, you have to have some strategy for pressurizing at the right moment when you're propelling into the ground, but still being able to expand to maintain velocity. Because one of the ways you can think about the relationship just from a physics perspective of, if you are not expanding enough, then you're too far into the ground. Like too far into the ground would be something that's heavy. It doesn't move very fast. It's hard to move. Versus if you expanding, you're coming a little bit away from the ground, so that helps to promote a little bit of velocity. So think about just an example of a squat, where if we add load to it, we're compressing it into the ground more, but it will certainly slow us down. So if we add assistance to the squat, we'll usually expand us away from the ground a little bit more. It allows us to go faster with the same movement. So there's this interplay when we're talking about speed between expansion and compression. We're timing the compression to the propulsion to the ground, but we don't want to be in the ground that long or we slow down. So we need this balance back and forth. And we can't be too specific with how we say how we're going to breathe specifically with speed activities because it's really dependent on how long you're going for. And then relaxation is similar to endurance in a lot of ways, but then we can manipulate this in different ways. So extended slow exhalations tends to be a nice starting point. It's just checking in with how long someone can breathe out for, and then cueing them to be able to breathe out a little bit longer gradually so they don't feel threatened by it. That could be a very powerful thing. A nice fluid expansion and compression. So, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, but very slow and smooth with that in and out so that it feels very even, and being able to train that and then build the time, with both sides of the breath, really. So generally, if you can gain more control of all four phases of your breath and be able to do it in a fluid way, then you're going to have more control over your relaxation response. And part of that fluidity is, being able to manage the pressure that you're trying to create. You're not trying to create a high pressure exhale or a high pressure inhale, but it's slow, even, usually quiet on the inhale. And then there's some type of sound that indicates pressure is releasing from the body on the exhale, gradually slower over time. And again, there's this balance between trying to train someone's breath in a way that slows it down, but doesn't force them into a place where they feel threatened, because then there'll just be a rebound effect of the body trying to hyperventilate because it feels like it's suffocating. So we have to be very gradual with how we try to train people's breath control, especially towards relaxation or to slowing it down. And then one of my favorite quotes is for breathing when we're looking at this from a relaxation standpoint or just a general mindfulness of the breath is Jack Kornfield, who's a phenomenal insight meditation teacher, and he just uses the terminology is it's the body breathing itself. So if you get into a place where you are really just mindful of the breath and you're just observing it, you're not doing the work, and you realize that you're really not doing the work that you think you are with the breath anyway, because it is always at play to keep you alive, and we can control it in some ways. We have voluntary control over it, but then there's many times that we want to relinquish that control. So if we can get to that point where we just notice the body breathing itself, to me, that's like the ultimate relaxation response when it comes to breath. Some anatomical landmarks for breath control that, and this will tie into a discussion about joint mobility. Many discussions that we have about joint mobility as we go joint by joint over the course of further presentations, but tied into the breath and then how we can ride the breath and use that to enhance mobility would be areas like the interscapular region, the space between the shoulder blades. Um, Bill Hartman calls this the dorsal rostral region, or it's a part of this area. And that's can be thought of as where the back of the lungs would inflate and create a posterior expansion. But this area is important, especially when we're looking at shoulder motion, where there's going to be a ton of compensation of the shoulder blades basically retracting together or coming closer together. So compressing when we're actually trying to promote shoulder motions that are more expansive, such as going overhead, flexion, abduction, external rotation. So as we try to do those things, we'll usually see more compression in this area, which is actually moving us away from the goal. So just being able to see that area, whether it's expanding or whether it's compressed, can be an important landmark. And then similarly down lower at the pelvis would be the area of the base of the sacrum. So if we are taking a good expansive inhale, the base of the sacrum should theoretically move backward, and the whole sacrum should counter nutate, because basically the sacrum and the pelvis is opening up to catch that pressure that's moving down from the guts. And then that would make in this case, the outlet actually close down because the coccyx moves a little bit more forward and closes down, because we want it to close down because all that pressure is moving downward. So during a good expansive inhale, we have counternutation, sacrum moves back, outlet closes, inlet opens, and then vice versa during the exhale, where we'll get more sacral nutation that opens the outlet a little bit more, closes the inlet a little bit more. So we have this rhythm going back and forth. So just important landmarks to consider, maybe bring some clients' attention to bring some palpation to the area, bring some, massage balls to the area so that we can gain some insight into how easy is it to create motion in that area with the breath. And then the pelvic diaphragm goes hand in hand with that conversation, where as we're changing the position of the pelvic inlet and pelvic outlet, then the pelvic diaphragm and the muscles around that area have to then respond to that. So this is where the breath and the muscle activity of the pelvic floor, are inextricably linked, really. So again, if we don't have good breath control and we're trying to promote muscle activity within the pelvic floor, a lot of times we're maybe creating more pressure than we should, and we're doing things that we have good intentions, but they actually might be moving things in the wrong direction. So I think oftentimes the breath is one of the most important things to be able to work with people to help their pelvic mechanics there. And I know there should be a lot of pelvic floor therapists on this call or listen to this presentation, so please chime in with your experience here. But as far as my limited experience in that area specifically, I certainly see the relationships between the breath and the pelvic floor muscles. And then the lower rib cage is the area of the bucket handle motion or the lateral expansion of the rib cage. We're also looking at this is basically the lower rib cage is the area where the respiratory diaphragm is. So as we dome out that diaphragm during the inhale, we should get lateral expansion, but we should also get posterior and anterior expansion. It should be a circumferential type of movement. So I know a lot of times the posterior rib cage here around the posterior diaphragm that gets compressed quite a bit, and patients will complain of pain and tightness and cramping sometimes in that area. So just getting some breath into that area, cueing that area to be able to expand could be very useful. And then up a little bit higher, we have the area of the sternum and the anterior rib cage, which we can think of as more of a pump handle motion. So you think of pump handle as the bottom part of the sternum will move anteriorly more than the top part, but both the top and the bottom of the sternum are expanding anteriorly, while we have the area of like the dorsal rostral region expanding posteriorly. But just the bottom part of the lungs tend to expand a little bit more than the upper part of the lungs, just based on gravity, for the most part, being upright human beings. We can think of the lungs fill from the bottom up like you would fill a glass of water. So the anterior expansion here is pretty important, though. As I mentioned before, if you're doing exercises where we're trying to promote, say, like a hand behind back, shoulder internal rotation, adduction, and shoulder internal rotation, adduction, and extension, then a lot of times we have to look at this anterior rib cage and is it actually able to expand? Because if it's not, then a lot of the motion that we're getting from the shoulder tends to be compensatory. And then finally, we'll look at the tongue, jaw, and then also just head and neck position and the influence that that has on the airway and then diaphragmatic mechanics. So the cues that I usually like to give is the spot behind the two front teeth, which is the actual term for that is the incisive papilla, and having the tongue lightly touch that area, and then lips slightly closed, teeth don't touch. So that could be a nice starting position for a nice nasal breath to make sure that there isn't too much compression of the teeth biting down. And then also the mouth isn't open, so the lips are lightly closed, teeth don't touch. Then we have this light contact with the tongue to the incisive papilla. But then during the breath, we can also promote, during the inhale, the tongue expands a little bit, and now it fills the whole top of the palate. And where the exhale, it kind of compresses back to a point, but still stays on that incisive papilla. So using the tongue mechanics to tie into the expansion and compression down the chain could be quite useful. And then thinking about where is our tongue, our jaw in relation to our head position. So oftentimes we might tuck our chin and think about retracting our neck, but we also really like retrude the jaw, or if vice versa, if we protrude from the cervical spine, the jaw might follow, to be able to dissociate actions from the head and neck and the tongue and jaw. But then also appreciate that, we don't want the head and neck to be too far forward, too far back if we're trying to have the most open airway. So just appreciating some of those relationships there. And then finally, we'll look at the idea of gravity, position, and the breath. So, gravity can enhance or resist the expansion of compression of the breath. So we just have to think about some of those relationships. So for example, supine would theoretically assist posterior expansion just based on gravity because it promotes this front to back motion, and it would also promote maybe more anterior compression. Problem is usually when we're in supine, we're lying down in such a way where the back is being compressed by the surface that we're lying on. We have to look at this from a perspective of, although we're getting assistance from gravity, that we might not be the best position to expand that area. And instead, we may get more of a widening of the body medial-laterally and a flattening of the body anterior-posterior because of the surface that we're lying on. Where prone is sort of the reverse. It can assist anterior expansion, but it also resists it somewhat because we're on a surface that might get in the way of that motion there. So it really depends on where we are, and how the state of the muscles that are involved in breathing. So if we can actually feel that pressure of the floor and breathe into that, we might actually use that as some feedback to help us expand anteriorly there. But if it feels like it gets in the way, now it's like lifting a heavier weight, and some people might not be ready for that. And again, it can widen the body more medial laterally and flatten it anterior posterior because of just the surface that we're lying on. Where quadruped might be, a better position because it can assist anterior expansion to a greater degree than prone because we have nothing where our chest is hitting, no surface that we're hitting. The downside is if some people have a difficult time just maintaining a quadruped position just because the lack of arm strength or a lack of hip strength, and they're creating a lot of concentric orientation or muscle tension just to be in the position, and that's going to get in the way of a full excursion of breath. So we have to keep all these relationships in mind when we're picking the positions that might be optimal to get people to expand and compress where we want them to. The thing that's also interesting about quadruped, just based on some muscle relationships, if we do have the shoulders in sort of a 90-degree angle of flexion, the serratus anterior can be very active there. And just the nature of the serratus anterior can compress the rib cage side to side, which might limit some of that widening of the body medial-laterally and help to take some of the flattening anterior posterior away. And then at the hips, because the hips tend to be at a 90-degree angle of flexion, that can help to assist in the closure of the pelvic inlet. So it kind of promotes things more towards internal rotation there. Side lying tends to be a really good position for assisting bucket handle compression. If somebody's got like a really big rib flare on the front, putting somebody in side lying can be really useful to help them to feel the bucket handles kind of compress and come together, which would also help generally with a longer exhale to allow the respiratory diaphragm to peak more upward. There is some resistance from the ground to the bottom side bucket handle, but during the exhale, you kind of get this relationship between the ground and gravity that helps to compress everything. So also limits the widening and flattening of the body medial laterally and anterior posterior. And then inversions are another thing to consider. Like when we have the head lower than the hips, it can tend to assist expansion, more cranially towards the upper parts of the lungs, upper parts of the chest, upper parts of the dorsal rostral or interscapular region. So that could be very useful for movements of the shoulders when we're going fully overhead. And it also just decreases some of the tension down lower in the pelvis, and it can help guide the upward motion of both the respiratory and pelvic diaphragms. Although it does different things there, where the respiratory diaphragm, the recoil of it is going to be assisted, where the pelvic diaphragm, it might actually assist some of the concentric action of the pelvic muscles there. So in summary, breath is mobility. So to be restricted with the breath is to be restricted with joint motion somewhere. So I think that's a good thing to try to equate in many ways, where it's like if we are not focusing on the breath, but we're trying to get people's range of motion better, well, we're certainly missing out on something. And you can do a lot with never focusing on the breath, but you're definitely leaving some potential on the table if the breath isn't part of the conversation at some point. And then we can think about breath. It can enhance motion, as mentioned, but it can also resist it. And the resisting is where you look at it as you're actually trying to promote stability and strength and force production and things like that. And there's very few forces that are more important than the breath because it is this internal control valve or this internal pressure system that we really don't have with our other muscles. So the respiratory diaphragm and the pressure cascade that it creates with the breath is really the most powerful force producer that we have. All right. And then with all of this, with breath control, if we could just think about these three continuums that we're working with, the direction, the duration, the pressurization or the intensity of the breath, and try to match that with the intention or the why. So the where, the how long, how hard, match that all to the why. That to me is in one statement, it sums up breath control, and that's what we're trying to do. And then your intention can be, do you want to mobilize? Do you want to produce force? Do you want to conserve energy? Do you want to relax? Do you want to recover? Do you want to hit higher levels of consciousness? I mean, all of that is possible within the breath. So I hope that was useful. Please ask questions. Give me your case reports on how the breath has been useful for you or any problems you might be having clinically with understanding how to use breath with clients. And I'll be happy to add my input. See you next time.